The last thing Marcos Vidal remembered thinking, before the accident, was that he needed to pick up coffee filters on the way home. It was the kind of thought that belonged to a different world entirely. A world where the commute from the Tartarus Station reactor complex took 40 minutes in bad traffic, where his daughter had a school recital on Thursday, where the crack in the kitchen ceiling had been bothering him for 3 weeks, and he kept forgetting to call someone about it. That world had a particular texture to it. The weight of his badge on his lanyard, the burnt, plastic smell of the break room's ancient coffee machine, the way the security gate always beeped twice before it let him through, as if confirming that yes, he was ordinary enough to pass. He had lived inside that texture for 31 years, and he had been comfortable there, and he had never once imagined that the texture could simply stop. The contamination was nobody's fault. That was what they'd tell the inquiry board later. Assuming there was an inquiry board later, assuming anyone still cared. A microcrack in coolant manifold 7, invisible to the last 3 inspections, had finally given way at 14:47 on a Tuesday. Resulting vapor cloud was supposed to dissipate in the secondary containment corridor. Instead, due to a pressure fluctuation that 3 separate monitoring systems failed to flag, it had vented directly into the maintenance access tunnel, where Marcos was performing a routine walkthrough inspection. He didn't feel anything unusual at first. A warmth, a slight ringing in his ears. The emergency lights cycling to amber, and then the alarm. The one they tested every second Friday, but which, when it rang for real, had a completely different quality, a seriousness. A voice that usually jokes suddenly speaking plainly. He walked to the decontamination station. He followed every protocol. The hazmat team was there in 6 minutes, which was within acceptable parameters. They wrapped him in the silver suit and put him on a gurney, and the paramedics were calm and professional. And Marcos watched the ceiling panels of the access tunnel scroll past above him and thought about coffee filters. The ambulance was 7 minutes out from the hospital when the other vehicle ran the red. Marcos woke up, though woke up was not quite the right phrase, in a drainage ditch beside Route 9, with the sound of the overturned ambulance, settling metal on asphalt 40 meters behind him. He was aware of the gravel against his cheek. He was aware of the smell of diesel and the particular amber quality of the afternoon light through the eucalyptus trees. He was aware, after a moment longer than it should have taken, that he could not feel his body. Not that it was numb, not that it was gone. He simply had no body to feel. His first coherent thought was that he was dead. His second was that dead people probably did not have coherent thoughts. His third, after a careful survey of what was and was not present, was considerably harder to categorize. He was ahead, just ahead, lying in the gravel at the edge of Route 9, blinking at the eucalyptus trees, listening to his own breath. And yes, he was breathing, though he could not begin to imagine the mechanism, and trying very hard not to think about what he was not. He would think about that later. When he was somewhere quieter, he rolled. It took longer than he wanted to admit to figure out that rolling was how he moved, and longer still to find a rhythm to it. The gravel was uneven. The shoulder of the road sloped. He ended up in a patch of weeds at the edge of a drainage easement, staring up at the sky, and a large black bird regarded him from a nearby fence post with an expression that he chose to interpret as non-judgmental. He had to get away from the ambulance before someone found him. He understood that much. Whatever he was now, it was not something anyone had a protocol for. He had worked in nuclear facilities long enough to know how bureaucracies responded to things they didn't have protocols for. They contained them. They studied them. They wrote long reports and formed committees. And the thing at the center of all, that attention generally did not come out the other side. He rolled. By nightfall, he had covered approximately 2 kilometers, which was not impressive by any objective standard, but which felt to Marcos Vidal like a distance that mattered. The aliens had been in orbit for 11 days when he found out about them. He found out the way most people find things out, in the first hours after an event that changes everything. From overheard fragments, from a television left on in an empty room, from the expressions on the faces of people who didn't know he was listening. In this case, the television belonged to a farmhouse with an unlocked kitchen window. And Marcos had managed, through an exhausting sequence of maneuvers. He preferred not to think about, to position himself on the windowsill where he could see the screen. The images were military footage, the kind that gets released before anyone has decided what to say about it. Vast shapes occluding the stars. A thermal signature so large it had initially been flagged as atmospheric disturbance. Then the signal, or rather, the demand, because even before anyone translated it, the cadence was unmistakable. The anchor was using the word contact in a very careful way. The way news anchors use words when they have been told to use that word specifically, and not the word they actually want to use. Marcos watched from the windowsill for 3 hours. Nobody came into the kitchen. The aliens, which the government was calling the visitors, and which the anchor was calling entities of extraterrestrial origin, with the particular precisions of someone who has been given a style guide, had established a transmission on 17 frequencies simultaneously. The message, once decoded, was not ambiguous. It acknowledged human civilization in the way a property developer acknowledges the existence of an existing structure, noting it, assessing it, and indicating that adjustments were forthcoming. The word the linguists kept circling back to was not invasion. The word was correction. Marcos spent a long time looking at the shapes on the screen. Then he rolled off the windowsill and continued south. He made it to the city in 9 days. He did not think about how he made it. He thought about other things. The recital his daughter had played at when she was 7, piece she'd practiced so many times that he could still hear it exactly. Every stumbled note and then the recovery, the way she'd looked at him after from the stage to make sure he was still there. He thought about the specific weight of a coffee mug, the way a good one sits in your palm. He thought about the sensation of walking, the physics of a stride, and tried to remember it precisely enough that it still felt like something that belonged to him. He had been a meticulous man, organized, at detailed work. The kind of person who reads the entire manual before touching anything, who keeps records, who arrives 5 minutes early as a matter of principle. These were not qualities that the world tended to celebrate, but they were qualities that accumulated quietly into a kind of competence. And competence, Marcos had always believed, is the only thing you could actually count on. He still had his mind. He had his memory, his training, 31 years of experience in nuclear containment and reactor management. He had the peculiar clarity that comes from losing almost everything and discovering what remains. And he had, though he was only beginning to articulate this to himself, a specific and focused anger. Not the hot, consuming kind, but the cool, technical kind, the kind that sits in your chest like a correctly calibrated instrument and tells you, this is wrong, and it can be made right, and here is how. The city had the feeling of a place holding its breath. The screens on every corner showed the orbital images, the government briefings, the experts with their measured tones, and their carefully non-alarmist vocabulary. Foot traffic was thinner than usual. People moved with a slightly different quality of attention. The way people move when they are trying to appear normal, because they have decided that appearing normal is, under present circumstances, a form of resistance. He found the university on the 3rd day. Specifically, he found the physics department's ground floor laboratory, which had a window left partially open for ventilation, because the air conditioning had been broken since March, and the department had been waiting on a maintenance request for 6 weeks. The researcher who discovered him the following morning, a woman named Dr. Benedita Faro, who had been working through the night on a theoretical model she no longer believed would matter, took it considerably better than Marcos had anticipated. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, and then she said, in a voice that was almost entirely level, "You're the maintenance worker from the Tartarus station incident." "I am," Marcos said. "Saw the initial contamination reports." A pause. "They listed you as missing." "I suppose I am, technically." She looked at him for a long moment. She had the eyes of someone who has spent a great many years refusing to dismiss things that other people found dismissible. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. And then, because he was a precise man, it's strange. "But it doesn't hurt," she nodded, once, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Then she pulled up a chair and said, "All right. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment of contamination. The Vethkai, which was the closest approximation of what they called themselves, though they did not use sound as a primary communication medium, were not what the science fiction films had led anyone to expect. They were not bipedal. They did not have faces in any sense a human face recognition system would process. They communicated through a form of electromagnetic modulation that their biology produced naturally, and that human electronics had been mistaking interference for the better part of a century. What they had, and what no one had anticipated, was an extraordinary contempt for inefficiency. This was, in its own way, more frightening than malevolence. Malevolence could be reasoned with, appealed to, outmaneuvered. Contempt for inefficiency was simply a technical position, and the Vethkai held it with the serene certainty of engineers who have run the numbers and found them conclusive. Human civilization, by their metrics, was consuming resources at a rate approximately 600 times greater than the optimal configuration for the available stellar neighborhood. They had corrections to propose. The corrections were not optional. They did not understand why this was considered a hostile position. Dr. Farrow had been working on this problem for 11 days, was the same number of days the Vethkai had been in orbit, because she had understood within hours of the first transmission what was actually being communicated, and she had filed 3 separate urgent reports, and she had received 1 automated acknowledgement and 2 out-of-office replies. They're not using weapons, she told Marcos on the 4th day after she found him. She had set up a small cleared space on her lab bench where he could sit and see the monitors. She had done this without being asked, and she had done it without making it a thing. And Marcos found this small calibration of the world to accommodate him without comment, almost more affecting than anything else that had happened to him in the past 2 weeks. They don't think of it as violence, posing to reroute several critical atmospheric systems in what they consider a more optimal configuration. For them, overall system efficiency. From their perspective, there's no meaningful distinction. She pulled up a diagram on the secondary screen, but the rerouting would require altering the electromagnetic field distribution in the upper thermosphere, which would disrupt navigation systems, said. She glanced at him. Every aircraft, every ship, every satellite, every power grid with remote monitoring, he continued. He had worked for 31 years in nuclear facility management. He knew exactly what happened when electromagnetic monitoring systems went offline. Everything that requires a signal to operate, all of it, simultaneously. In a cascade failure pattern, yes, within approximately 72 hours of the rerouting. Marcos thought about this. Outside, the city's normal sounds continued. Traffic, a dog somewhere, the particular urban hum that cities make when they are pretending that everything is fine. Do they want in exchange for not doing it? He asked. That's the thing. Dr. Furrow rubbed her eyes. She looked like someone who had not slept adequately in 11 days. They don't want anything in exchange. They're not negotiating. They don't understand negotiation as a concept. In their framework, the correct action should be taken because it is correct, and any resistance to the correct action is itself a form of inefficiency to be corrected. So they've never encountered something that wouldn't cooperate. Not successfully. She was quiet for a moment. Transmission logs. The ones our linguists have been decoding. Reference 17 other systems they've corrected. The data sets describing those systems stop at the correction date. Marcos looked at the diagram. Then he looked at his reflection in the dark upper corner of the screen. The small, impossible, stubborn fact of him. And something settled in his chest like a reading coming into calibration. Show me the reactor schematics, he said. She turned to look at him. The station, he said, Tartarus. I know every system in that facility. I inspected every manifold, every junction, every failsafe and redundancy. And I have been thinking, for 9 days of rolling across the countryside, about a very specific property of the contamination I was exposed to. He paused. The Vethkai operate on electromagnetic modulation, he said. It's their communication system, their nervous system, their entire technological substrate. Everything they do through EM fields. He could see her getting there. The reactor, she said slowly. Tartarus Station was a prototype. The new generation electromagnetic containment system. The one that caused the manifold failure. The one that put me in this condition. It generates a field profile that I have never seen duplicated anywhere else. In 31 years, I have never seen anything that produces that exact EM signature. He held her gaze, and I am now, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, generating that signature from inside my own skull. The silence in the laboratory had a particular quality to it. "You're saying you're a transmitter?" she said. "I'm saying I've been contaminated with a field profile that the Vethkai would experience the way we experience a sound played at exactly the frequency that resonates with the bones of your inner ear. Not a weapon, not a signal, something more fundamental." He thought about how to say it. An argument they can't not hear. It took Dr. Faro 4 days to confirm it. Not the transmission, that she confirmed in 6 hours. With equipment she had to recalibrate 3 times because her first readings seemed impossible. What took 4 days was the theoretical framework for what it meant. Because the physics of his condition required her to revise several assumptions she had held since her doctoral thesis, and Benedita Faro was not the kind of scientist who revised foundational assumptions lightly. On the evening of the 4th day, she came back into the lab with 2 cups of coffee, set one on the bench beside him out of habit, and then caught herself and almost smiled. "I've been thinking about how to explain this to people," she said. "Don't," Marcos said. "Figure out how to use it first. You're not curious. I spent 9 days rolling down country roads as a head, Dr. Faro. I had time to come to terms with most of the more alarming aspects of my situation. What I am curious about is whether we can actually do anything with it before the Vethkai start their rerouting sequence." She sat down. "They've given us a timetable. 6 days. Do we have access to the Tartarus station facility? It's been evacuated and sealed since your accident. The emergency protocols. I know the protocols. I wrote half of them." He thought for a moment. "The electromagnetic containment array in the second decanary reactor chamber has a broadcast range of approximately 40 kilometers when operating at full capacity. That's the test range they never exceeded because of regulatory concerns." He paused. "What happens if you exceed it?" She looked at him carefully. "Theoretically, the field inversion produces a resonance cascades that would propagate through any compatible medium at speed. R. Functionally a compatible medium." Yes, she was very still. "Marcos, what you're describing would be like setting off a—" "I know what I'm describing. I'm describing the only thing I can think of that has any chance of working." He met her eyes. The thing about losing your body, he had found, was that certain conversations became very simple. The scaffolding of posture and expression, and all the small physical performances that humans use, communicate fell away, and what was left was just the thing you were actually saying. "I am not a weapon," he said. "I am a human being who is in an unusual condition. But the Vethkai have looked at our world and decided, without asking, what it is worth. I would like to offer them a second opinion." The drive to Tartarus Station took 3 hours in a university vehicle, in the dark, with Dr. Faro driving and Marcos on the passenger seat, a situation that had required the invention of a novel restraint system using a lab clamp, some foam padding and a length of bungee cord, and which was, Marcos reflected, either the most dignified or least dignified arrangement of his career, and he had decided it didn't matter. They passed 3 military checkpoints. At each one, Dr. Faro showed her faculty credentials and explained that she was continuing critical research into the contamination event. At each one, the soldier on duty looked at the car, looked at her credentials, and waved them through with the slightly glazed-ish expression of someone who had been on shift for too long in a situation that had too many variables. None of them looked at the passenger seat. Marcos thought about this on the drive, about invisibility and what it was worth. He had been, 31 years, the kind of person that systems trust without thinking. Not because he was powerful or prominent, but because he was consistent, because he was good at what he did, because he showed up and did the detailed work without complaint. The badge, the lanyard, twice beeping security gate. They had been a kind of invisibility too, in their way. The invisibility of the competent, unremarkable person who keeps things running. He was still that person. He was just also, now, an impossible thing rolling down Route 9 with a plan. The station was dark, the perimeter lights running on backup power. The familiar compound of low buildings and cooling towers, rendered strange by the military cordon and the general sense that the world around it had changed its priorities. Dr. Furrow had the override codes. She'd filed for research access 3 days prior, which had been approved by an administrator who was, in the chaos of the current situation, processing requests on autopilot. The secondary reactor chamber was exactly as Marcos remembered it. He had spent over 31 years, hundreds of hours in this room. He knew the sound it made, the quality of its hum, particular coolness of its recycled air. He knew which control panel had the sticky third key on the left bank, and which monitoring terminal had the screen that went blue in the lower left corner when the temperature differential exceeded a certain threshold, and which inspection hatch required you to hold it at a precise angle or the seal wouldn't seat properly. He knew it the way you know a place that has been part of your life long enough to become part of you. Dr. Furrow set him on the primary control console and got to work. The array sequencing, she said, pulling up the control interface. Walk me through it. Main bus first. You want to bring the containment coils online before you engage the broadcast matrix. If you reverse the sequence, the field inversion happens inside the chamber instead of outside it, and that's not something either of us survives. Noted. Hands moved across the controls, with the precise economy of someone who has spent her entire adult life making instruments and do what she needed them to do. The primary coils need to reach 70% before you engage the secondary bank. There's a lag in the feedback loop. The system was designed to compensate for it automatically, but the automatic SAT compensation gets confused by the higher field density we're going to be running. You'll need to watch the feedback manually and adjust. Manual adjustment range? Plus or minus 12% on the harmonic modulator. The display will want to stabilize at 8. You need to hold it at 11. She nodded. She was setting the parameters. The hum of the facility was deepening as systems that had been dormant for 2 weeks came back online, and Marcos felt something he hadn't felt since the accident. A familiarity that went beyond thought, a sense of being exactly where his particular set of skills had been building toward without his ever knowing it. Marcos. She paused at the interface. Once the array is at full capacity and we initiate the broadcast, the resonance cascade will propagate through the HFY neural network. I don't know what that does to them. It might be like a very loud noise. It might be like losing their senses. It might be, I know. We're not killing them, I want to be clear. There's no indication the cascade is lethal to Benedita. He used her first name, which he hadn't done before. She paused. I have not at any point proposed killing anyone. I have proposed making an argument they cannot ignore. There's a difference, and it matters. He looked at the interface. The HFY correct things they find inefficient. They need to understand that we are not a thing to be corrected. We are a thing that corrects back. Pause. That's not a threat, it's an introduction. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the controls. Primary bus engaging, she said. The HFY became aware of the signal at what would translate, in human timekeeping, as approximately 2:14 in the morning. It was not like anything in their experience. Their experience was vast. They were old, in the way that civilizations have become old when they solve the problems that destroy young ones. And they had encountered a great deal in that time. They had encountered resistance, the crude mechanical kind, weapons and shields, and the various energetic tantrums that young species threw when they did not understand that the mathematics had already been decided. They had encountered compliance, which was more common, which they found neither satisfying nor dissatisfying, because satisfaction was not a category they applied to the correction of inefficiency. They had encountered absence, the cold archaeological kind. Systems that had corrected themselves before the HFY arrived and left only the patterns of what had been. They had not encountered this. The signal, if it could be called a signal, did not communicate information. It did not broadcast data or language or any structured content that their interpretive systems could parse. It was not a weapon, in any sense their damage assessment protocols recognized. It was something considerably stranger, a field profile that resonated with the deepest layers of their neural substrate, at a frequency they associated, in the oldest partitions of their collective memory, with the formation of their own world. It felt, insofar as the Vethkai felt anything, like a question. Not a question they could parse, not a question in any language, a question in the most fundamental sense, the electromagnetic equivalent of one entity looking at another and saying, "I am here, what are you?" And underneath that, woven through it in a way that no deliberate signal could have achieved, because it was not deliberate, because it was simply what Marcos Vidal was, the entire texture of a human life, 31 years of consistent, unremarkable, essential work, the weight of a coffee mug, a child's recital, imperfect and recovered, the specific patience of someone who reads the manual, who keeps records, who arrives 5 minutes early, who rolls 2 kilometers in a ditch at the edge of a road because there is something to get to on the other side, and the getting there is non-negotiable. The Vethkai had 17 datasets describing corrected civilizations. They had never encountered one that sent back. The rerouting sequence was suspended at 2:31 a.m. Dr. Faro was watching the monitoring feed from a secondary terminal, her hands still on the harmonic modulator, holding it at 11% because the system kept wanting to drift. The Vethkai orbital signatures had been shifting for the past 12 minutes. The thermal bloom changing shape in a way that the military satellites were logging as inconclusive but significant. "Something's happening," she said. "Yes," Marcos said. "Are they?" She checked another readout. "The transmission frequency is changing. They're broadcasting on the primary contact band." A pause. "Marcos, they've never used the primary contact band. That's the one reserved for." She stopped. "For what?" In their communication framework, she was reading very carefully. "Primary band is what they use when they encounter something they've been wrong about." The silence in the reactor chamber had a new quality to it. The hum of the containment array continued, deep and steady. The cooling system cycled. Somewhere outside, a nightbird called once and stopped. "How wrong?" Marcos asked. She looked at the feed for a long time. "Fundamentally," she said quietly. The negotiations, which the Vethkai did not call negotiations, because they were still developing vocabulary for the concept, which was what they were, lasted 11 days. They were conducted primarily through Dr. Faro's adapted monitoring equipment, with Marcos serving as what no one had a word for, an anchor, a reference point, proof of the proposition. The Vethkai were not simple, and they were not converted, and they did not become peaceful in any narrative sense. They were engineers who had encountered a data set that invalidated a core assumption, and they were doing what rigorous engineers do, revising the model. The revision was slow and thorough and not without friction. There were moments when the signal from the array faltered, when the Vethkai orbital configuration shifted in ways that made the military liaison officers, who were now belatedly involved in the process, very tense. There were moments when Marcos, sitting on the primary control console day after day, felt the particular exhaustion of being the most important, unremarkable thing in the room. On the 9th day, primary translator, a linguist named Costa, who had been working on the Vethkai communication system since the first transmission, came to the reactor chamber and sat down across from Marcos with the expression of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything. "They have a word," Costa said, "in the oldest register of their language, the register they use for foundational concepts, for what they're experiencing. The closest I can render it is the encounter with evidence that your model of the universe requires correction." Marcos thought about this. "They have a word for being wrong," he said. "More than that. It's a sacred word. In the sense that their entire civilization is built around the correction of inefficiency, and this is the word for when the correction comes back around to you. It's not shameful. Costa searched. It's considered the highest form of the process. The moment when the system improves itself." Marcos was quiet for a while. He could hear the array humming. He had been in this room for 9 days. He had slept somehow, on the control console, an experience he could not adequately describe. And he had eaten nothing, because he no longer required food, which was still strange, but was no longer the most strange thing about his situation. "Tell them," he said finally, "that we have a word for that too." "What word?" Marcos thought about his daughter's recital. about the stumbled note and the recovery, about the specific moment when she'd looked at him from the stage to make sure he was there. Learning, he said. On the 11th day, the Veth-Kai fleet altered its orbital configuration in a way that the military satellites initially flagged as a hostile maneuver before the pattern became clear. They were moving to a wider orbit. Not leaving, they were not leaving, and no one had expected them to leave. And the world was going to have to build something new to hold the relationship that was now forming. But creating space, the electromagnetic equivalent of stepping back from a conversation to give the other person room to speak. Dr. Farrow was in the lab when Marcos heard. She had finally, after 11 days, gone home to sleep for a few hours and come back with a change of clothes and a thermos of coffee, and she was updating her field notes with the slightly dazed focus of someone who is doing familiar work in an unfamiliar world. "What do we do now?" she asked, when he told her about the orbital shift. "You write the paper," he said. "It'll be the most important paper anyone has ever written. It'll also be the most unpublishable, because no peer reviewer on the planet will accept a study in which the primary instrument is a disembodied human head." She almost laughed. It was a good almost laugh, genuine in a way that a real laugh might not have been. "What about you?" she asked. He had been thinking about this. Not constantly. He had too many other things to think about constantly. But the question had been there, in the background of every day since he'd rolled out of that ditch on Route 9. Patient as a calibration reading, waiting. He was not who he had been. He was not what he had been. He was something that the world did not have a protocol for, and probably never would, and that was going to require a great deal of ongoing improvisation from everyone involved, including him. His daughter was going to need time to adjust. His colleagues, the ones who had been calling the missing persons line, were going to need considerably more time. The world, broadly speaking, was in the early stages of needing to adjust to a great many things at once, and Marcos Vidal was only one of them, and not even close to the most alarming. But he had been, for 31 years, a person who showed up and did the detailed work, who read the manual, who kept records, who held the harmonic modulator at 11% when the system wanted to drift to 8, because the system was wrong and the 11 mattered. And the difference between 8 and 11 was the difference between something that worked and something that failed. There was a great deal of work ahead. There was a great deal of careful, detailed, essential work that no one else had the specific knowledge to do. And Marcos had never, in 31 years, left a job incomplete. "I stay," he said. "There's more to do." Dr. Farrow looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her field notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote the date at the top of a new page. "Then we'd better get started," she said. Outside, the city was coming back to itself. Not the same city it had been. That city was gone, with its coffee filter errands, and its commutes and its automated security gates that beeped twice. And Marcos was honestly not sure how much of that world he missed, and how much of it had simply been the scaffolding inside which he had not yet become the thing he apparently always was going to be. But the sounds were the same. Traffic, a dog somewhere, particular urban hum of people deciding, collectively, to keep going. The array hummed. The cooling systems cycled. The Veth-Kai fleet held its new orbit. And from the surface of the Earth, in the pre-dawn dark, configuration looked almost like something deliberate. Like letters in a language no one had learned yet. Marcos thought about his daughter's recital. About the way she had looked at him afterward, not just checking that he was there, checking that the performance had been received, that something had passed between them in that room that was real. That it had mattered. He had been there. It had mattered. He was still here. The work continued. 6 weeks later, the first joint research team was established. It had 23 members, 12 human, 11 Veth-Kai, and one that fell into a category everyone agreed required new paperwork. The Veth-Kai representatives communicated through a field modulation array that Dr. Farrow had spent 3 weeks building from modified components, and a great deal of creative problem-solving. The human representatives communicated in the usual way, with the usual mix of precision and impression, and the productive friction between people, trying to understand each other across a genuine gap. Marcos was the translator. Not because he spoke any language the Veth-Kai used, Because whatever the contamination had made of him, it had also made him legible to them, in a way nothing else was. The way a reference signal makes a measurement possible. He sat in the middle of the conference table. The research team had built him a small platform at table height. He accepted with the dignity of a man who has long since made his peace with unusual circumstances. And he held the connection steady while two civilizations talked. It was detailed work. It was essential work. It was the kind of work that nobody would remember the details of in 100 years. Only the outcome, only the fact that it had held when it needed to hold and had not, despite everything, broken. Marcos had always been good at that kind of work. He held. Outside, the morning came in over the city. The cooling towers of Tartarus Station stood against the early light, and somewhere in the maintenance records of the facility, behind every protocol and inspection report and safety log, was the name of the man who had written most of them. Not a remarkable name, not a famous one. Just the name of someone who had shown up, day after day, and done the work, and who had turned out, when the moment required it, to be exactly the right kind of impossible. The meeting began. The universe, per its long habit, continued. The Veth Kai sent their first question on a Thursday. It arrived not as language but as a pattern. A careful, deliberate arrangement of electromagnetic pulses that Costa had been learning to read the way you learn to read a new handwriting, slowly at first and then all at once. He brought it to Marcos on a printout, which felt anachronistic given everything. But Costa was the kind of person who thought better on paper. They want to understand, Costa said, what we call the relationship between a unit and its function. Marcos looked at the printout. They're asking about purpose. They're asking whether we distinguish between what a thing is and what a thing does. In their framework, the two are identical. Is its function. There is no meaningful remainder. Marcos thought about this for a long time. Long enough that Costa shifted in his chair and almost apologized for the silence, which Marcos had come to recognize as one of Costa's habits. The apology in waiting, the social anxiety of someone whose work required infinite patience and who nonetheless found silence difficult. Tell them, Marcos said finally, that we have a word for when a thing stops doing what it was built for and starts doing something else. We call it growth. Costa wrote this down. We're going to need time to process that. I know. So did I. There was a window in the conference room. The joint research team had been relocated from the reactor chamber to a converted university conference room after the third week. Once the infrastructure for stable Vethkai communication had been established, and it became clear that the work was going to take considerably longer than anyone's initial crisis mode planning had allowed for. The window looked out onto the university's main courtyard, where students still moved between buildings with their coffee cups and their bags and their phone screens, though with a slightly different quality of attention than before. Awareness. Marcos had come to think of it. The world had become aware of itself, in a new way, the way a person becomes aware of their own breathing once someone mentions it. He had watched a lot of mornings come in through that window. On the first morning, he had watched a pair of undergraduate students stop in the courtyard and look up at the sky for a long time, not doing anything else, just looking. Then one of them said something to the other and they both laughed. Not the nervous laugh, not the gallows humor laugh, but a genuine one, the kind that surprises you, and continued on to wherever they were going. Marcos had found this very important. He could not have said exactly why. He thought about it now, watching Costa translate the concept of growth into electromagnetic pulse patterns with the careful precision of someone translating poetry. The thing about growth, he had decided, was that it was almost always uncomfortable. The discomfort was not a sign that something was wrong. It was a sign that something was actually happening. His daughter came on the 22nd day. Her name was Clara. She was 34 years old and worked as a civil engineer, which made a particular kind of sense when Marcos thought about it. The apple, tree, the invisible thread of inclination that runs through generations. She had her mother's eyes and Marcos's habit of arriving early. She had always considered one of his better legacies. Dr. Farrow had arranged the meeting carefully, which was its own kind of consideration, not in the reactor chamber, which was functional but cold, Not in the conference room, which was full of equipment and strangers. She had set up a small space in her own office, which was cluttered with books and had a plant on the windowsill that was doing better than it deserved to given how infrequently she watered it, and which felt, in aggregate, like a place where difficult things could be said without requiring a performance of them. Marcos was on the desk. Clara came in and stood in the doorway for a moment. He had thought about this meeting for 22 days. He had thought about every possible version of it, every possible reaction, every possible first thing to say. He had discarded all of them. In the end, because he was a precise man, he said the only thing that was true. "I'm okay," he said. "I know it doesn't look like it, but I'm okay." Clara looked at him for a very long time. He could see her working through it, the shock, the grief, the relief that he was alive, in whatever sense he was alive. And underneath all of that, the thing he had hoped she might get to eventually. The recognition. The plain fact of him. The person she knew, still present in the voice, and the phrasing and the particular way he cut to the point. She crossed the room and sat down in Dr. Farrow's chair. "You're working," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Is it important?" "Psst. It's the most important work I've ever done, and I've spent 31 years doing work that people depend on without knowing it." So the bar was already reasonably high. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her recalibrating, the same thing she had done as a child when she encountered a problem that required her to revise her initial reading of a situation. She had always been good at that. Better than him in some ways. "Does it hurt?" she asked. The same question Benedita had asked, the right question. "No," he said. "It's strange. Every day is strange. But the work is real, and the people are real, and what we're trying to do matters." A pause. "I missed your recital." She looked at him. "When you were 7. The piece you practiced for 3 months. The one you almost got perfect." He held her gaze. "I've been meaning to say, not missing it, watching it. Every detail of it. I've had a lot of time to think about it." She pressed her lips together, not against crying. She wasn't going to cry. She was too much like him for that. But against something that needed a moment to resolve before it became words. "You remembered," she said. "I remembered everything," he said. "I'm good at details." She laughed. It was the right laugh. The genuine one, the kind that surprises you. "Yes," she said. "You always were." She stayed for 3 hours, Dr. Farrow left them alone and went to work in the laboratory down the hall. And Marcos and Clara talked the way people talk when they have been given a second chance at something they thought was over. Carefully at first, and then less carefully, and then not carefully at all, which was the right direction to go. When she left, she came back to the doorway and said, "I'm going to need a few weeks. I know, but I'll come back." "I know that too." She did, and she did after that and after that. The adjustment was slow and uneven, which was how adjustments to real things actually work. And there were visits that went better, and visits that went worse, and one very bad afternoon, when she said some things she later apologized for, and Marcos said he understood, because he did. He had spent 31 years learning the difference between understanding something and being able to speak it, and this was one of the things he understood. He was still her father. He was still here. That was not nothing. On the 41st day, the Vethkai sent a new pattern. Costa took 3 hours to decode it, and when he brought it to the joint research team meeting, he was quiet in a way that made everyone else in the room quiet too. "They want to share their record of the corrected civilizations," he said. 17 of them. The room was very still. "Why?" asked Dr. Anand, the team's xenobiologist, who had been arguing for caution in the information-sharing process since the beginning. "They say." Costa checked his notes. "They say that the corrected civilizations were all, in their assessment, efficient by the measures they used, but that they now believe their measures were incomplete." He paused. "They want us to help them understand what the measures were missing." Marcos looked at the pattern on Costa's printout. He thought about 17 datasets that stopped at a correction date. He thought about what had been in those datasets before they stopped. 17 worlds of coffee mug weight and children's recitals and the twice beeping security gates of routines that people had lived inside for generations. 17 textures. Gone. He thought about the Vethkai, who had traveled for longer than human civilization had existed, and who had, in all that time, Never had someone push back. Never had something show them the pattern from the other side. Who had a sacred word for being wrong and had perhaps never, until now, had occasion to use it. They were not evil. That was the hardest thing. They were not evil. And the civilizations they had corrected were not restored. And the weight of that was real and permanent. And Marcos was not going to spend his time tending it wasn't. But they were here, and they were asking, and the question they were asking was genuine. "Tell them yes," he said. "Doctor." And looked at him. "Tell them yes," he said again. "We'll help them build better measures. That's the work. That's what this is." He looked around the table at the 12 human faces and the 11 Vethkai field arrays pulsing their participation. "We're not here to punish anyone. We're here to make sure the next 17 datasets look different." It was not a speech. He was not a speech-making kind of person. But it settled something in the room that had needed settling, and the meeting continued. Months passed. The world adjusted, which it does. Which it always does. Because adjustment is one of the things the world is very good at, even when it doesn't want. B. The joint research team published its first paper in a new journal because no existing journal had a framework for what they were doing, and it was read by more people than any academic paper in history, and it was also the most argued about paper in history. And Marcos considered both of these things appropriate. Vethkai contributed data on 12 stellar systems that contained the early signatures of emerging civilizations. 3 of those systems had previously been flagged for correction. They were removed from the correction queue. The committee to monitor them included a rotating human representative, which required a new institutional structure, which required a great deal of paperwork, which Marcos helped write because he was good at institutional structures and paperwork, and because if you want a thing to hold, you build it carefully. His daughter got married the following spring. He was there, Dr. Faro built him a transport system, a mobile platform, discreet, functional, and drove him to the ceremony herself. And he sat in the front row in the way he always had, quiet and attentive, and exactly where he was supposed to be. The groom was a good man who worked in urban planning, and who had, after the initial adjustment period, taken to addressing Marcos with the comfortable directness of someone who had decided that unusual situations were best handled by not making them a bigger deal than necessary. Marcos respected this enormously. During the reception, someone put on music and the floor cleared, and Clara danced with her new husband, and Marcos watched, and the light in the room was warm, and the food smelled of things he no longer needed, and it was fine. It was more than fine. It was the world continuing in all its ordinary, irreplaceable texture. He thought about the Vethkai word for being wrong, the sacred one, the one that meant the system had improved itself. He thought that the human word for it was something else, something smaller and harder to define. Lucky. The array hummed through the long nights at Tartarus Station, even after the joint research team moved to its permanent facility. It hummed because Marcos had asked that it be kept running, not for any technical reason, but because the sound was familiar, and familiarity was a thing he had come to value more than he could adequately explain. He could not adequately explain most of the things he had come to value. He had never been a man who explained himself much. He had been a man who showed up and did the work, who held the harmonic modulator at 11 when it wanted to drift to 8, read the manual and kept records, and arrived early, and noted carefully in his own internal log the moments that mattered. His own internal log was considerable. The universe continued, which was its long habit, and the Vethkai fleet held its orbit, which was no longer a threat but a fact, the way the moon was a fact, present, gravitational, part of the new shape of things. The world below turned through its days, ordinary and extraordinary, and mostly somewhere between the two, somewhere in the maintenance records of Tartarus Station. Behind every protocol and inspection, report and safety log was the name of the man who had kept it all from going wrong. Not heroically, not dramatically, just carefully. Just by being exactly the right kind of impossible, at exactly the moment when impossible was the only thing that would do. He had showed up. He had done the work. The rest, as he had always believed, was the part that took care of itself. The morning came in. The meeting began. He was still here.